I want to talk this week about the doctrine of continuity, and that states that what is done for Christ in this life carries over into the next life. Now, the doctrine of continuity is a little bigger than that. It also talks about what is done in the Old Testament carries over into the New Testament. Some of the things that are continuous are the character of God. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Another thing that's continuous in the Bible is God's unfolding story of redemption. The New Testament completes the story of redemption in the Old Testament, but that will also carry over into eternity, because when we see Christ in eternity, we're going to see the nail prints in his hands and in his feet, and so we're going to be reminded of that. Another thing that is continuous is God's moral laws. In the Old Testament, the moral laws carry over into the New Testament. Now, yes, the punishments for that doesn't, because the Romans were in charge of the government in the New Testament, and in America, our government is in charge of that. But the moral laws are still the same. God is always the same. So the apostles assumed that most Jewish laws would continue unless it was specifically said that they wouldn't. Are there some things that didn't continue? Sure. The dietary laws. In the book of Acts chapter 10, verses 9 through 16, Peter has a vision where God says, all these foods are now clean for you to eat. So those dietary laws didn't carry over. The Jewish sacrificial system, Jesus fulfilled that, so we don't have to sacrifice a lamb every year anymore. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 24 through 28 says that. The Jewish law, or the Old Testament covenant, is now written on our hearts, not on tablets of stone. That's in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 33. So the general rule is things will continue as they were unless specifically addressed. Again, because of this, the Jewish Christians assumed that God's character and his moral laws didn't change, even though penalties for violating them did change. Another thing I want to talk about is the judgment seat of Christ, and a lot of Christians are not very sure of this. Now, when I talk about all Christians will appear before the judgment seat of Christ, this is not judgment for salvation. That was taken care of when we received Jesus into our hearts. John chapter 3, verse 16, Acts chapter 4, verse 12. This is judgment for what we did in this life for Jesus. In other words, the works that we did for God in this life. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 10 through 15, it says this, by the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should build with care, for no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Christ Jesus. If anyone builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or stubble, their work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each person's work. If what has been built survives, the builder will receive a reward. If it is burned up, the builder will suffer loss, but yet will be saved, even though only as one escaping through the flames. And then in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10, it says, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each of us may receive what is due us for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad. And then in Revelation chapter 22, verse 12, it says this, and this is Jesus speaking, "Look, I am coming soon. My reward is with me, and I will give to each person according to what they have done." So, the works we do for Jesus in this life will be tested with fire. The works that we did in faith will survive. The works that we didn't do in faith won't survive. They'll be burned up. Those that will survive will follow us into eternity, and that'll determine the type of the crown of life that we'll get. A former evangelist from the last century, C.T. Studd, said, "Only one life will soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last." Now, I also want to take a look at Revelation chapter 21, verses 24 through 27, and I'll explain why after I read it. It says this, "The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. On no day will its gates be shut, for there will be no night there. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. Nothing impure will ever enter into it." Okay, the nations are going to bring their splendor, glory, and honor into the New Jerusalem. That's what it was talking about here. What splendor, glory, and honor? People make up nations, so this could be the collective works that survived God's fire. Many theologians think that's the case. Remember, according to Romans chapter 11, verse 29, the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. So whatever good things God made you with were for eternity. Even if you didn't become all that you were meant to be in this life, you will become that in eternity. Let's face it, most of us probably missed some things, but God's ultimate justice will prevail. He won't forget what we have done in His name and in His strength. Hebrews chapter 6, verse 10 through 12 says that. Also, in Matthew chapter 16, verse 27, Jesus says, "For the Son of Man is going to come in His Father's glory with His angels, and then He will reward each person according to what they have done." Okay, now let's talk about what the future heaven is going to be like. Not the intermediate heaven that is there now, but the future heaven. I think the new earth is going to be more than just what Eden was like. It's going to include a carryover of the culture of these nations. Again, in Revelation chapter 21, verse 24, where it talks about the nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. And the glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. So, all we love about the old earth that is not sinful is going to be ours on the new earth, and a whole lot more. Only the curse is going to be removed. If you go to Romans chapter 8, verses 20 through 23, it says, "For the creation was subject to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it," that's Adam, "in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we eagerly wait for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies." Many of the godly things we did on earth are going to carry over into the new heaven. One thing we can say is there are going to be mountains. In Revelation chapter 21, verse 10, and it says, "And he carried me away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God." Okay, we definitely know that there is going to be mountains. There are probably going to be lakes, granted, not seas. We'll get to that later. There's probably going to be flowers, maybe even the greenery that we see. You know, in the fall, when it turns colors and you have all these explosions of yellows and reds and everything like that, maybe that's going to be how the new earth will be the whole time. Who knows? But if we imagine that the new earth to have fewer or lesser beautiful features than the old, that would be a regression. And since sin affects everything in a negative way, that just doesn't make sense. So I think the new earth is going to have more beautiful features, not less. If you turn to Revelation chapter 21, verse 1, remember, the earth is going to be renewed, not destroyed. And it says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away." Look at God's work in creating natural wonders right now in our fallen universe. Olympus Mons is on Mars. Now, Mars is about half the size of the Earth. Olympus Mons is a mountain on Mars that is 3 times as high as Mount Everest. The base of Olympus Mons would cover the entire state of Nebraska. The Valley Marineris on Mars is incredible. The Grand Canyon on Earth is about 1 mile deep and 273 miles long. The Valley Marineris on Mars is 4.5 miles deep, and it's 2,500 miles long. It goes 1/6 of the way around the whole planet of Mars. Imagine, and that's Olympus Mons and the Valley Marineris are on Mars right now. Imagine what we would find on a new Mars, on a resurrected Mars, or a new Jupiter with its magnificent moons. Think about the new Earth's waterfalls. I mean, we've been to Niagara Falls. It's gorgeous. And when we were there and we were looking at all the water flowing over it, somebody pointed out to us, they shut off half of the water years ago. So what we were seeing was half as beautiful or as gorgeous as the first people that saw Niagara Falls. The new waterfalls on the new Earth may dwarf Niagara Falls. We may find new rock formations that are way more spectacular than the ones in Yosemite. We may have mountain peaks that are way higher than the Himalayas. Could you imagine the hiking trails on the new Earth? Wow. Now, there is some current phenomena that won't be on the new Earth. Earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, etc., etc. On the new Earth, if you take a look in Revelation chapter 22, verse 1 and 2, it says, "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God down to the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves are there for the healing of the nations." So we know there's going to be a river of life. We know there's going to be a tree of life. In fact, in Ezekiel chapter 47, verse 12, it says this, Fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river. Their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fail. Every month they will bear fruit, because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. Their fruit will serve for food, and their leaves for healing. Why would we need healing in heaven? Well, we won't experience pain or disease, but maybe this fruit or these leaves from the tree of life will have life-sustaining or life-enhancing powers that help our body to maintain health and energy. Why would we need food at all? Well, while we still will have needs, they'll all be met. Now, granted, we don't have the exact answers for those two questions, but the suggestions are really interesting to think about, aren't they? Now, let's discuss what's going to become of outer space and time. Well, the New Jerusalem is described in Revelation chapter 21 in detail. I mean specific detail, the entire chapter. Why would God go into great detail unless it was meant for our education? While some passages in Revelation 21, or even in the Bible, suggest that the universe will wear out and be destroyed, others indicate it will last forever, like in Psalms 148, verses 3 to 6. This isn't contradictory. Like us, we're going to be destroyed by death, but we'll be resurrected to live forever. Earth was the first domain of our stewardship, but it may not be the only domain. Because the whole of creation fell under the curse of our sin, it makes sense that the whole universe was meant to be under our dominion. If so, then the entire universe will be ours to travel to and explore. Are the restored planets just mere ornaments, only meant for us to look up at? Or are we destined to explore them? What do you think will happen when we have resurrected minds, using resurrected technology and unlimited resources, and no more death? Since God is creative by nature and we're made in His image, our creativity is going to be unleashed. It's going to be resurrected and righteous. Remember, our creativity is not the problem. The curse was. Yes, when we cracked the atom, we thought, wow, we have what a great source of energy. But then we also used it to make a bomb. That won't happen in the new heaven. With resurrected minds, resurrected creativity, resurrected technology, everything that we learn is going to be used to benefit. It's going to be used to God's glory. You know, even under the curse, we've been able to explore and land on the moon. We've sent satellites to Mars and other planets. I imagine that we'll explore other worlds, not as conquerors who seize what belongs to others, but as faithful stewards who can occupy and manage the full extent of God's physical creation. God has built into us the longing to see the wonders of His far-flung creation. I think the popularity of science fiction reflects this longing. Granted, it's tainted by our sin nature, but it's still there. And when you think about it, the doctrine of resurrection is an emphatic statement that we will live forever as physical beings in a physical universe. Maybe we'll be able to see other dimensions also, instead of just the four that we see today. The four we see today are length, width, height, and time. Maybe one of those other dimensions will be a relational dimension, where other beings can see our true intentions and our real feelings. Don't worry, our true intentions and real feelings are going to be good and pure. Won't it be great to be finally to be able to be understood completely? So time and space aren't evil. They're good because God made them that way. back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, God looked at all he had made and he said, it's good. So time and space are going to be redeemed, not eliminated. Will we be able to be in several places at one time? Probably not. Only God can do this. One of his attributes is called omnipresence, meaning he can be everywhere at one time. The promise of heaven is not that we will become infinite, but that we'll be far better finite human beings than we've ever been. Even though we may be able to move rapidly from one place to another, let's say, we also may be able to pass through solid objects, just like the risen Jesus did. In John chapter 20, verses 19 and 20, when the apostles were meeting, this is after the resurrection, they were meeting in a closed room and the door was locked, and yet, boom, Jesus appeared before them. So maybe we'll be able to pass through solid objects. I don't know. But remember, we'll still be finite. Another question some people have is, will we know everything? Again, probably not, as only God knows everything. That attribute is called God's omniscience. I think learning is going to be much, much easier and much, much faster, again, because we won't have our sin nature to deal with. We'll be discovering things forever. The universe is a big place. God made the universe. I think we're going to be discovering things forever and ever, and we're going to marvel at God's creation. Time will exist. In Revelation chapter 22, verse 2, it says, on each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. So that's one thing that I think that says time is going to exist. Another thing is in Isaiah chapter 66, verse 22 and 23, where it says, as the new heavens and the new earth that I make will endure before me, declares the Lord, so will your name and descendants endure, from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, all mankind will come and bow down before me, says the Lord. Again, we see that time is going to exist. In Genesis chapter 8, verse 22, after the flood, God promises Noah, and he says this, as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. So we'll live with time, but we won't be under its pressure anymore. Without the curse, time will not work against us. Most of our time right now is spent working for our sustenance. Genesis chapter 3, verses 17 through 19 says that it won't be in the new heavens. Won't that be great? And we'll get into what we're going to do in heaven. Are we going to have jobs? Things like that. We'll get into that in the coming weeks. But I think that's going to be fantastic. Now, most other religions, like Buddhism, teach that time and matter, i.e. our bodies, will be extinguished. Christianity teaches the opposite of that. It teaches that both time and matter, our body, will be redeemed and resurrected. God is the one who inhabits eternity. Isaiah chapter 15, chapter 57, verse 15 says that. His creatures, us, inhabit space and time. Jesus, as the God-man, inhabits both.